A big warm welcome to the UN Global Compact Academy. I'm Sarah Kruger-Falk, the Executive Director of Global Compact Network Denmark. And today I'm excited to welcome you back to our Academy Changemaker Series here from Copenhagen in Denmark. With this series, we want to help you learn directly from some of the most innovative and influential people around the world. Our guest today is the Vice President at the multinational energy company Ørsted. Overseeing the organization's sustainability strategy, he was heavily involved in Ørsted's transition from one of the most fossil fuel dependent companies in Europe to a global leader in the green energy sector. I'm so delighted to welcome you, Filip Engel from Ørsted. Over the next 30 minutes, we will learn about what motivated Ørsted's transition to a more sustainable business model, what lessons learned for how to make transformational change happen, and the important role of collaboration for a net zero future. Last but not least, we will learn about Filips' take on what future-proof leadership skills and characteristics look like.
To start out, we'd love to know a little more about you, Filip, and where your sustainability journey began. What are some of the concrete experiences you had as a business leader that made it clear to you that focus on sustainability was critical for a long-term success?
So I think I'll actually mention an experience from my childhood more than as a business leader. I remember vividly the day I read in the newspaper about greenhouse gases effect, and I think I was probably 11 or 12 years old. I remembered clearly that was when I first understood that something was not right. Something in the way that we worked as human beings, as societies, we needed to change that to make sure that long term we would thrive.
And I think it's very interesting to hear that you, as a person that was focused on that, also chose to join a fossil fuel intensive coal and oil company.
Yeah, well, that's a good observation. And I did that because I sensed that something was brewing at the company. Back then, called Dong Energy, it was one of the, as you point to, one of the most carbon-intensive energy companies of Europe. We were mainly a Danish company. We had a lot of coal-fired power plants, and we also had some oil and gas production in the North Sea. But I was interviewing for a position, and I could sense, but I was also told that this position would be about helping to communicate and to guide sustainability-wise also the transformation to renewables.
Do you know where the transition inside the company came from, and what formed Ørsted's move towards that?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of pressure points. One of them was the fact that at the moment our business model was simply struggling. You know, there was, when you looked ahead back in, so we're talking about 2008-9, and when you looked ahead, it didn't seem too promising to have a business model that was based on fossil fuels, and especially the coal-fired power plants. And then the second pressure point was that the climate agenda was on the rise. The EU had started to adopt some climate targets. There were more and more conversation about the need to change energy from fossil fuels to renewables. You had Al Gore's film around the same time. And you know, as a company, you know, we had a strategy to build coal-fired power plants, and in some of the countries where we wanted to do that, in Germany, for instance, we were facing demonstrations saying, no, you don't come here and build your coal-fired power plants. And so it was pretty clear that something was happening, but back then it wasn't evident that that was material and that would be long-lasting. If it were, I think more companies would have done like we did and would have changed towards renewables. But we thought that we needed to change because that was where the future of energy would be. That would be where the future of energy business would be. And also because, yeah, I mean, it was the right thing to do. And that was a drive that came very, very much from top management, especially from the CEO back then. Anders Eldrup, who had a clear view of the company needing to change. And that view has then been followed and accelerated by his successor, Henrik Poulsen, as CEO, and now our CEO for 1.5 years, Mads Nipper. So I can't not say clearly enough how important it is, that's at least my experience, to have that top management buy-in to make that change.
And that's so interesting, because our next theme is actually to take on the challenge. How do you go about this transformational change that you need to do as a company? And sharing our experiences and strategies of overcoming these challenges is also crucial to help others along the way.
Yeah.
So that's why we focus on this Changemaker series. So you want to transform the business from one based on fossil fuels to one based on renewable energy. And to find a business model that's both environmentally and financially sustainable. How do you go about that? Because you were so focused on coal and fossil fuels.
Yeah.
How do you change the business model overnight or over a number of years?
What we've done is to change from by far having fossil fuels. I think it was 85% of our power and heat generation that came from fossil fuels, to now being around 90% of our power and heat that comes from renewables. So we've changed that, and we know in the next couple of years we'll be very, very close to 100%, and we'll be a carbon neutral company in our energy production and operations by 2025.
Really cool.
And that sounds like
very, very cool.
Well, yeah. That's also a real privilege to have been a part of. But when you say it like that, it almost sounds easy, right? I just made that switch, but it has been very challenging. It has been very, very, very difficult. And one of the challenges was, as you point to, what do we then do instead? And obviously that was not easy to find that answer. And the answer we actually found with back then 50 people, it wasn't more than that, who sat in sort of in a corner of our offices and who had built some experiences in offshore wind. Back then we had built a couple of offshore wind farms, relatively small compared to the scale today. But that was the capability, if you will, we identified to build on and to scale up. Obviously, quite a bit, because, as I said, it was very few people who we had, and our competencies did not have a lot of legacy. But no one had that. There wasn't really a supply chain. There was no one out there who had actually more experience than we had. Actually, we were one of the more experienced companies. So it was quite immature technology. But we identified that as the foundation for our future business, and then we went all in on it, and we allocated resources to that, both financial but also human. And started to scale up, and that is in a nutshell how you do that. Obviously, it also needs to stand on the back of a business environment where it's possible. So there's a lot to be said about how policymakers and also industry, of course, have worked with us in scaling offshore wind to the extent that it was the core of our transformation. But actually, more than that. It is now, today, a viable, mature technology, renewable technology, with the potential to supply energy to the equivalent of hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. It cannot do it alone at all. And we are also today active in solar energy and in onshore wind, and we are looking a lot at and working with green fuels. But offshore wind is a key component and one of the sort of backbones of that transition that the world has to and is in the process of undergoing.
And I think that's such an interesting point, this to go from a business case that's viable, that you know you need to leave, and to another one that's so unsecure in many areas. And I want to talk about these internal and external pushbacks and how you were challenging that. To be in a company where you want to make a change, but there's this massive awareness from outside and maybe also a lot of pushback inside. How do you challenge that, and how do you address that?
I guess you could say that there were probably two key points during our transformation where it was sort of make or break. And the first challenge that we were faced with was simply to realized that we had to change.
Yeah.
And I think that's the first challenge that anyone is faced with. Yeah. And that is difficult. And so just to give you a couple examples of how that played out. One of my first meetings I had was in a room with maybe 10 people. And you had everyone sort of involved in positioning. You had the head of marketing or branding and the head of CSR, as it was called back then, the head of corporate comms and head of investor relations in the room. And on one side of the table, you actually had the colleagues who said, we should not go out and say anything about the need to transform, the need to do something about climate change and our need to reduce our emissions because we had high carbon emissions. Why? Because it was too risky and eventually the climate focus would probably die down. And on the other side of the table, you had the people who said that we needed to say something about it. We need to come out on this strongly. And the discussion was heated. And I'm not saying this to throw the colleagues who were sort of opposed to coming out under the bus in any way, because it's natural that there are different views in a process like this. So it just goes to illustrate how diverse the views are, and why is that? I think, well, for one reason, it's not just a job you're doing; it's identity. Think about it. We were one of the leading companies in building and operating coal-fired power plants. We had 3,000 people.
Exactly. How can that be an advantage if you want to?
Exactly,
leave it?
and it wasn't, clearly, because then suddenly you're being told if you do that, if you're an engineer and you are an expert, and then suddenly you're told that it's not good anymore. It's not just that it's not good. It's something that the world doesn't need. It's dangerous to the world to continue to do that. That's hard to take in for human beings. And another example was that the strategy team responsible who worked with the power plants, they were given the task to come up with a plan for how to change, how to phase out coal and go to renewables. And essentially they said, it cannot be done, because it was so transformative that the models they were looking into, they just couldn't see a different reality. Obviously, because those models on sort of the energy system, they are based on some assumptions. For instance, one assumption that renewables is very, very much cheaper than fossil fuels. So if you just model your stuff based on that assumption, you end up with the conclusion that it can't be done. So you need to challenge yourself. And say, what if we can reduce the cost of renewables? Can it then be done? So those were examples of how difficult it was. And the way that we tried to overcome that was, for instance, that management in this case set up another team to do those analysis, to try to draw up that plan for how we would make the change. And secondly, it was remarkable to see how leadership used communication externally to drive the change internally. So
that's really interesting, because I was going to ask you, with all this pushback from internal actors and from external as well, what was the driver? And this is communication as well. So you use fantastic.
I mean, if you work in the field of communications, I think don't let anyone tell you that that it can't be a major force for change, because we had a vision for where to go. We wanted to change from fossil fuels to renewables, and to do it within, back then it was 3 decades. So by 2040 we want to have made the change.
Yes, was your time span.
Yes, by 2040. Then we ended up doing it by 2020. But that was the vision. But the plan to get there, and how to do it, that wasn't clear. So instead of spending endless time internally on discussions and strategy meetings and bringing in consultants and endless discussions at a time where a lot of the business actually didn't feel comfortable on making that change, management was very clear in communicating externally that this is what we need to do. And that became a self-fulfilling sort of fact and prophecy, in the sense that then our stakeholders started to really expect it from us. Politicians, NGOs, public media. And so eventually it became a fact of something we had to do. And that was a key in driving the transformation. And obviously it can be risky because you can also see a backlash.
No one can change a system by themselves. And you've said that you're part of something much bigger than your company. You're part of this whole green transition. But who are and who have been your most crucial allies in the transformation?
It's pretty clear that that policymakers in the northwestern European markets who bet on offshore wind have been key allies.
Yeah.
So governments in Denmark, to some extent also Germany also did quite a lot, and the UK, they have been key. They've been instrumental. Very concretely, you needed policymakers because it's policymakers governments who procure offshore wind. So you needed them to say, we want to have built this much offshore wind, because that gave certainty, long-term certainty to the industry, and that enabled us to invest in it. It enabled other companies to invest. So you build a supply chain that could deliver on that. And because you then started to do that, you could deliver on the project. So you had scale, and as you had scale, you know, prices come down, and because you have that learning, you come down a little, and that's been crucial. And there was a time around 13, 14, and that was the other crucial point where it was a bit make or break. We could lose everything on the floor. At that point, the industry had not sufficient scale so that if government support and also subsidies had stopped, the industry would probably have died. And that was a critical time because governments were facing recession, but they stuck to the commitment at that point. And 4 years after, we started to deliver the first offshore wind projects that were competitive and then eventually cheaper than fossil fuels.
4 years.
It is so important for how we are to this learning here that governments and industry need to work together, and how governments can shape a market that the companies can then deliver on, and that creates a positive feedback cycle where you then bring down the cost, and then governments can go more and can become more ambitious, and then industry can scale up even more. That insight is key when it comes to so many of these fundamental challenges that we are looking into as a world, being the climate challenge or biodiversity or what have you. You need that strong collaboration if you want to solve those challenges and find solutions to them.
And it's challenges that we're all going to experience, so we need to work together.
Yes.
That's a very strong point that I'll also take with me. Do you feel the momentum for transformation is actually growing now?
Yeah, so the momentum for transformation is growing, but it's a strange time to be in, because on one hand I'm more positive and hopeful than I've ever been that the transformation will happen, but at the same time I'm almost more depressed than I've ever been, in the sense that time is running out.
Yeah.
We have many of the technologies we need. We have offshore wind, we have solar, we have onshore wind, and they are cheaper than fossil fuels. We also are starting to see green fuels based on hydrogen that will replace fossil fuels in shipping, aviation. We have all of that. Obviously, there's still some challenges to solve technology-wise, but essentially we have the solutions. We also have a lot of capital out there wanting to invest. So it's not that's the challenge. In essence, the challenge is leadership. We have the technologies, we by and large have the capital. We need leadership to remove the barriers, also policy-wise, that inhibits the acceleration of the transformation. There is a consensus about, I would say, by and large, that this is where we need to go. But at the same time, time is running out, and we only have a couple of years left to really start to reduce the global emissions, and that looks very difficult.
And why is that?
We're not doing more rapidly because we have so many legacy barriers that we just continue to be stuck in. So, for instance, we still governments around the world still support financially fossil fuels to the tune of, I do not know how much money it is, but it is an insane amount. and that's legacy, and it builds a lock-in in your system that's hard to get out of. Because what happens if you take that away? Maybe it's not a big issue in a rich country like Denmark, but in other countries, you suddenly take those subsidies away, prices will go up. So how do you manage that? It's just one example of the barriers that we need to tackle. Another example could be that if you want to have more renewables, you also need to build the infrastructure to get the energy from A to C. It's difficult to build it. People, they want renewables, but at the same time, when they hear that something will be built close by and there's going to be sort of a power line, even if it's going to go underwater, but there's going to be some construction work, then they don't want it right there, right?
You are taking leadership in Ørsted. You've also recently set this net zero science-based target, and you are the first energy company to do so in the world. Why is it important to also be, the front runner and being on the cutting edge, and what's good about it and what's difficult?
So what's good about it is that when you talk about climate change, but essentially also other sustainability challenges, it's not good enough to do something. You have to do enough. Yeah. So or more even, preferably more. Yeah. And our carbon emissions trajectory is a good example of that. We have reduced emissions not just as quickly as climate science says it's necessary to stay within 1.5 degrees, but actually a couple of decades faster. That's our scope 1 and 2, right? So our sort of own emissions, and we're now looking to the supply chain to also do the same, to bring down emissions quickly, and it's just necessary. When I started in this business, I remember that the dominant thinking around climate was sort of still symbolic, that you would do something and then that would sound good. But at the end of the day, it wasn't an initiative to, I don't know, turn the lights off, which is fine, but it wasn't a part of a coherent plan for how to reduce your emissions. No. And it needs to be, because if not, how do you know that you're doing enough?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important discussion on also this whole massive change in our mindsets and also rethinking what we do in all aspects of life. What are the main challenges and key steps in this next frontier of your climate journey? Because we have to move further. Yeah. You've already done a lot, but it doesn't stop here, and the challenges are also the picture and the challenge picture is also changing. So what's the next journey?
So we are at the point where we have almost transitioned completely to renewables in our own energy production, and will be carbon neutral by 2025. So now we've set sight on our supply chain. We started to do that 2 or 3 years ago, where we came out with a target to be carbon neutral in our sort of scope 3, including our supply chain, by 2040. And that's about decarbonizing hard to abate, so sectors where it's hard to bring down emissions, such as steel, such as heavy transportation from ships, for instance, vessels, and that is again transformative, because you don't, I mean, what the technologies are to produce low carbon steel, but no one has sort of doing it at the necessary scale. So it's a bit similar to the situation we were in with offshore wind. That's the next frontier on climate specifically. But I would say that our next transformation, sort of more generally, is bigger than climate. Yeah. It's about us as a company, how we want to transition to be a more sustainable company across the board.
We like to end with a lightning round on the future leadership. And for each question, say the first things that come to your mind. What other industry and organization or leader do you take inspiration from?
I actually think when I want to get inspired, I actually look backwards more than forward. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if you look at how the world has evolved historically, the changes, they always come as a surprise. Yeah. It is always almost the case that in the beginning, sort of incumbents and organizations and often society at large resist the change. And then you have parts of society, for instance, on the fringes of society, whether it's NGOs or younger people who say, we need to change. No one first wants to hear what they have to say, and then eventually over time, they're proven right, And yes, then we do make the change. So I often look to those situations, and I think about those, whether it's sort of the civil rights movement or the movement against racism, or the movements against pollution, local pollution, to really remind myself that we need to keep pushing, and we need to listen to the voices in sort of the fringes of society. If you want to know how society will look like in 10 years from now and where you should go as a business, don't look to the mainstream conversation.
No.
Look to the fringes, look to the marginal voices, because that is where the change will come from. That's where you'll see what goes on. And don't be arrogant. Don't say, yeah, that's just some silly whatever organization, that will never happen. Because just look at what has happened. Just look at who championed responsible tax 10 years ago, right? Who listened to what those NGOs organizations said? No one. Mm-hmm. No one. It would never be a thing they said. Today you have clear guidelines from OECD and hardcore legislation also in more and more countries. Biodiversity, I think 5-6 years ago, most business leaders couldn't even pronounce it. No. But you had NGOs talking about it and starting to put it on the agenda.
You mentioned the young people, and few are more concerned about the future than the young generations. After all, they're also the ones who will be living it. What is the one thing that you can promise the younger generations? If you can promise them anything.
No, I can promise them one thing, and it's that they're right.
Yeah.
So they should keep on pushing.
Yeah.
They're on the right side of history. And personally, I don't want my son and my daughter to ask me in 30, 40 years, Dad, what did you do to help create the change? And then I can't really answer.
If you could give just one piece of advice to young professionals, what would it be?
I think the one advice I would give is to continue to stick to your guns, continue to push for the change. You are the young people. You are the future, and I can see that if you're our company, any company, if you want the best and the brightest to work for you, you need to pay attention to what they say.
Yeah.
So you are a force to be reckoned with. You are a force for change, and you are very powerful if you channel your views of where the world should go. So make your choices based on that. Also with respect to who you want to work for.
What are the 3 most important characteristics leaders need to create change in today's world?
The most important, one of the most important, I'd say, is to challenge your assumptions, to listen to voices that say something differently than what you believe in, to take them in and think about them and be willing to challenge your own beliefs and assumptions. Because if you don't do that, then you risk that you don't see the next thing that comes your way, the thing that at the moment is perhaps a bit on the fringes, but then in 10 years or 5 years maybe even, will be a fundamental boundary conditions in how the business environment is being shaped. Mm. The second, I would say, is to dare to take the leap of faith. When we talk about transformations, not everything, or by far, can be analyzed into detail, and I think it's very human, also as a business leader, that you want to be able to account in detail for both the upsides and the downsides of making a transformation. But exactly because it is a transformation, that is really hard to do, because the transformations challenge. They challenge the board. They make the landscape look differently. Yeah. So the models, if you will, that you use to make those analyses, they can capture what will happen on the other side of the change. That was the case for us when we started the transformation. If you took the models back then, they said, forget about it. Renewables, never going to happen. Why? Because one of the assumptions was that renewables would stay much more expensive than fossil fuels forever. Mm. Right, so you can't account for that clearly. So instead of trying to get absorbed into detail, you also need to take more of an insight perspective. Try to find the fundamental insights that tells you what's the right direction, and then accept at the end of the day that there's a leap of faith. And then finally, the third thing I want to point to, continue to communicate your vision.
Yeah.
If you then have set your direction, continue to communicate what that direction is, why you're doing it, what the benefits will be, and to make sure you get both your own organization, but also obviously stakeholders on board with where you're going.
Yeah. Filip, thank you so much for giving your insights, and
was a
thank you
pleasure.
to all the participants joining us in this conversation. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. I think that what I take from this conversation with you is that we have to be very courageous. We have to be very bold
Yes.
and visionary. We have to listen to the corners of society, and then we have to be persistent in continuing to push and continuing to work. And then a very important thing that I wouldn't have thought about before I sat in this chair is that we have to communicate why we're doing it and why it's important, to also convince everyone inside the company and also the politicians and the whole community around the company. We want to be a force for good, and I think you've been a fantastic example on a company that has done it, and even done it 20 years faster than expected, which is really very, very impressive. So Filip, thank you for joining this conversation, and keep up the fantastic work for our future generations. Thank you.
We'll try, and thank you so much for having me, Sarah.
Thank you.